At 21, she surrendered her heart to her best friend's driver, a powerful judge in disguise. Have you ever felt like your thoughts were the only real thing in a room full of empty conversation? A single, solid object in a world of ghosts? That was the daily reality for Emmy Parker, a scholar, an idealist, living in the brilliant, blinding shadow of her best friend's empire, feeling like a philosophical quote in an accounting ledger. The only person who seemed to understand the weight of the silence between her words was the man in the front seat, Reese, the family's enigmatic driver. Their connection was a quiet one, built not on stolen glances, but on a shared stillness, on an attention that seemed to hold more substance than all the frivolous talk around them. Driven by the profound loneliness of her 21st birthday, a milestone that felt more like a marker of her displacement than a celebration, Emmy decides to risk everything on this unlikely connection. She surrenders her trust to the one man she believes is her intellectual anchor. The only problem, the man she's fallen for doesn't exist. Reese is a disguise for Judge Finn Cooper, a billionaire and one of the most powerful, reclusive names on the bench. Weary of a world where his authority had become a gilded cage, isolating him from the very human truth he was meant to serve, he hid himself in plain sight. He was searching for something real. He just never expected to find it in the back seat of his own deception. This is the story of two people who found each other while hiding from their worlds. A story about how the truest connection can be born from the deepest omission. And it asks the question, what happens when you fall in love not with who a person is, but with the integrity you believe they represent? Get ready, and let's begin the story. Drop a heart emoji in the comments if you believe some connections are worth any risk. And don't forget to subscribe for more intense and emotional romances. This is a story about identity, trust, and a love so powerful it might be the only thing capable of surviving a verdict. The silence inside the Maybach was an engineered thing, a manufactured tranquility. It was a barrier of supple, hand-stitched leather and double-paned glass, designed to insulate its occupants from the pulsating, chaotic symphony of the city outside. It muffled the angry horns of taxis, the distant wail of sirens, and the percussive roar of the elevated train. It left only the low, soothing hum of the tires on wet asphalt and Clarissa Davenport's crystalline voice, which, by contrast, cut through the conditioned air like a shard of ice. Absolutely tragic. I mean, the handbag was so obviously last season. I almost died of second-hand embarrassment for her, Clarissa said, her thumb swiping effortlessly across the glowing screen of her phone, her world contained in a 4-inch rectangle of light. In the back seat beside her, Emmy Parker offered a murmur of agreement she had perfected over years of practice. It was a vague, non-committal sound, empathetic enough to be polite, but hollow enough to require no follow-up. Her eyes were on the window, but she didn't see the magnificent skyscrapers tearing through the grey, weeping sky, or the neon lights bleeding like watercolors into the puddles on the street below. Her attention, as it so often was in this car, was focused on a single steady point: the man in the front seat, Reese. To Clarissa and the entire Davenport dynasty, he was a function, not a person, an extension of the car itself, a silent, stoic presence in an impeccable black uniform, whose steady hands on the wheel were as guaranteed and as taken for granted as the sunrise. But to Emmy, he was an anachronism, a man whose stillness seemed to hold more weight, more substance than all of Clarissa's frivolous conversations combined. He was a question she couldn't answer. She found herself studying him, collecting details like a researcher gathering data, the small things, the way a single muscle in his jaw would tighten just slightly when traffic on the avenue came to a complete, frustrating stop, the profound economy of his movements. He never gestured, never fidgeted, never moved without a clear and quiet purpose, and his eyes, which she only ever caught in brief electric flashes in the rearview mirror, were a deep, stormy blue, the color of the lake just before a squall, and they held a geography of experience that Emmy, with all her books and theories, couldn't even begin to map. He couldn't be more than 35, yet there was a gravity in his gaze, an ancient weariness that didn't belong to a man so young, a settled calm that felt earned, not affected. "Who are you?" she wondered, the thought as silent and contained as the man himself. "What do you think about when you're trapped in here listening to breathless gossip about last season's handbags? What worlds exist behind those eyes?" Their relationship, if one could even grant it such a term, was a tapestry woven with the threads of the unsaid. It began not with a word, but with a gesture, a minuscule, almost imperceptible act of observation. There was the afternoon she'd spent in the university archives, a frustrating, dust-filled hunt for a single, obscure, legal precedent. She had climbed into the car late, exhausted, overwhelmed by the scent of decaying paper and the pressure of her looming dissertation. Clarissa, already inside, was on the phone, detailing the crisis of a broken heel. As Emmy finally sank into the plush leather seat, a bottle of chilled water was extended back over the console. It wasn't offered by a servant. It was presented by a peer. His hand was large, his fingers long and sure. "You look like you need this." His voice, a low, calm baritone that seemed to absorb all the noise around it, enveloped her. There wasn't a hint of subservience in his tone. It was a simple statement of fact, an observation, an acknowledgement. Her heart, so often still and steady, gave a strange, powerful leap. "Thank you, Reese." He just nodded, his eyes already back on the road, but Emmy felt a warmth spread through her chest, a small, quiet island of genuine kindness in Clarissa's vast ocean of excess. He had noticed. In a world where she felt perpetually overlooked, he had noticed. Then there were the books. In a rambling, one-sided conversation with Clarissa weeks ago, Emmy had mentioned her admiration for the quiet stoicism of Marcus Aurelius, quoting a passage about finding tranquility within oneself. Clarissa had rolled her eyes, muttering something about a digital detox retreat being a more practical solution. Emmy had let the subject drop. 2 weeks later, as they waited for Clarissa to finish a life-or-death call before deigning to enter the car, Emmy noticed a book tucked into the seat pocket in front of her. It was a worn paperback, the corners soft with use. Meditations. Emmy held her breath, her chest tightening. It wasn't a new copy. It was read, used, understood. Her eyes flew to the rearview mirror. Reese was looking straight ahead, his profile as impassive as carved stone, but she saw it. The faintest shadow of a smile touched the corner of his lips for a fraction of a second, a secret acknowledgement that existed only in the space between them. In that silent, charged moment, the luxury car transformed. It became her sanctuary, the only place on earth she felt not just seen but truly understood. He listened. He remembered. He engaged in their silent dialogue. In a world that consistently made her feel that her intellectual passions were mere eccentricities, that small act of remembrance was everything. The contrast with his daily reality was a knife. "Reese, the bags! And be quick!" Clarissa would command, her voice sharp, already halfway through the revolving door of her apartment building, without a single glance back. She never said thank you. "Have a good night, Reese," Emmy would always say, pausing for a moment before closing the door, her small act of rebellion. "Thanks for the ride." He would meet her gaze in the mirror, and the professional mask would soften for an instant. "You too, Emmy." The way he said her name. There was no rush. Each syllable was pronounced with a deliberate, resonant clarity that sent a shiver down her spine. He was the only person in Clarissa's orbit who didn't shorten it, who didn't treat her name, her very identity, as an inconvenience. Today, the rain beat against the glass in a hypnotic, melancholic rhythm. Clarissa finally ended her call with a dramatic sigh. "I need a drink. I'm utterly drained. Reese, let's go to Aria." "Yes, Miss Davenport." The reply was instantaneous. Respectful, empty. Emmy looked down at her own hands in her lap. There was a small, stubborn smudge of highlighter ink on her index finger, a stark, fluorescent reminder of her own world, so distant from this one. She was a scholarship graduate student, an anomaly. Clarissa's brainy friend since childhood, a role she increasingly found ill-fitting. She loved Clarissa, truly, but being in her orbit was like standing too close to the sun. It was warm and dazzling, but it was also exhausting and, at times, blinding. The car stopped, its motion so smooth it was almost imperceptible, in front of the exclusive club. A valet in a crimson jacket rushed over, an umbrella blooming open. "See you inside, Emmy," Clarissa said, hopping out onto the covered sidewalk as if she were royalty. Emmy hesitated. She grabbed her bag, the worn canvas a declaration of otherness against the immaculate leather of the seat. Her eyes met Reese's in the mirror one last time. There was something different in his gaze tonight, a heightened intensity, a melancholy that seemed to mirror her own restless soul. "Are you going to be okay out here?" she asked, her voice a near whisper, the question escaping before she could stop it. The question seemed to catch him by surprise. It was personal. It breached the unspoken protocol. He turned slightly in his seat, the first non-functional, purely human movement she had seen him make in months. He looked at her directly, without the distorting filter of the mirror. The impact was like a punch to the gut. The proximity, the absence of barriers, was overwhelming. His gaze held hers, and for a moment she felt like he could see every thought, every insecurity she'd ever had. "I'm paid to be okay, Emmy," he said, but his tone was soft, stripped of any irony. There was a deep, tired truth in his words that resonated with her own exhaustion. She felt a sudden, desperate need to say something more, something real to bridge the chasm between their roles. But the words died in her throat, caught behind a barrier of social impossibility. Instead, she just nodded, a small, helpless gesture, and stepped out into the rainy Chicago night. The sound of the heavy car door closing behind her was solid, final. It sounded terribly like a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter she hadn't even realized she was writing. As she walked toward the club's glowing entrance, she couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on her. She was an unfinished thesis, a collection of complex arguments and unproven theories, a rough draft in a world of polished, published masterpieces. And for some inexplicable reason, she felt that Reese, the silent driver, the man who spoke in gestures and worn paperbacks, was the only person who saw the essential argument behind the draft, the only one who might actually understand it. And that realization was, at once, the most comforting and the most terrifying thing she had ever felt. The interior of Aria was an assault on the senses, a deliberate and curated chaos designed to overwhelm and intoxicate, a cacophony of loud, confident laughter, the delicate, incessant clinking of crystal glasses, and a deep, pulsating electronic beat vibrated through the dark wood floor. The rhythm worked its way up the soles of Emmy's worn leather boots, lodging itself in her chest, an unwelcome, artificial heartbeat. Low, golden lights, strategically dimmed to flatter and conceal, cast long, dancing shadows. They turned the faces of the wealthy patrons into beautiful, moving masks of pleasure and profound indifference. The air itself was thick, heavy with a layered scent, the sharp botanical notes of expensive gin, the cloying sweetness of designer perfume, and underneath it all, the faint, metallic fragrance of effortless wealth. It was the smell of a world to which she had a visitor's pass, but never a key. Clarissa navigated the dense crowd like a swan parting the waters, her movements fluid and assured. A wave here, an air kiss there. Amy followed in her wake like a shadow, her canvas bag clutched against her body like a shield. Every smile she forced felt like it was pulling at the skin on her face, a painful, unnatural contortion. She felt like a fraud, a typographical error in a perfectly printed manuscript. Her thrift store jeans and simple silk blouse didn't just feel out of place. They felt like a different language entirely, screaming their plainness amidst the couture silks and impeccably tailored suits. Just breathe, she told herself. The familiar lie a desperate mantra in the face of her rising social vertigo. You're here for Clarissa. Just endure. They settled into a plush, crescent-shaped booth of red velvet, where a group of Clarissa's friends had already gathered. The conversations swirled around her, a vortex of topics as alien to Emmy as quantum physics, the tax implications of offshore hedge funds, the logistical nightmare of chartering a jet to Aspen at the last minute, the comparative merits of one model of yacht versus another. She listened, trying to find a foothold, a single point of connection, but it was like trying to grab smoke. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter, feeling the cold shock of the ice against her teeth. She tried to look engaged, nodding at what she hoped were the right moments. But her mind kept drifting. It slipped out of the noisy, overheated club and back into the cool, silent sanctuary of the Maybach on the cold, rainy street. She pictured him sitting in the car, the engine now certainly turned off to save fuel, the profound engineered silence of the vehicle finally filling the space with its own presence. What did he do during those endless hours of waiting? Did he read? She imagined him pulling the worn copy of Meditations from the seat pocket, the pages soft beneath his fingertips, his mind 1,000 miles away in ancient Rome. Did he listen to music? Something quiet and melancholic that matched the rhythm of the rain on the roof? Or did he just sit and watch the city, his thoughts a deep, dark ocean beneath the placid surface of his expression. The image of him, alone in the darkness, sent a strange, sharp pang through her chest. It was a feeling of kinship. It was loneliness. A loneliness she recognized so intimately because it was a mirror of her own, trapped in a gilded cage, just as she was trapped in this velvet one. "Emmy? Earth to Emmy." Clarissa's voice, sharp with faint exasperation, brought her back with a jolt. "Brandon was asking you about your thesis." Emmy blinked, her focus struggling to adjust from the quiet interior of her thoughts to the loud reality of the booth. She looked at the young man with slicked-back blonde hair sitting opposite her. Brandon. She vaguely remembered him from other such gatherings, the heir to some real estate magnate. He was looking at her with a condescending, faintly amused smile, the kind one might give a curious animal at a zoo. "Oh, yeah," Emmy stammered, feeling a flush creep up her neck. "It's on the philosophy of natural law and its application in modern jurisprudence." She immediately regretted the jargon, the defensive formality of her own words. "Fascinating," Brandon said, the word dripping with a boredom so profound it was almost an art form. "My father has lawyers, lots of them. They seem to deal more with practical jurisprudence," he said, making dismissive air quotes with his fingers, "than with philosophy. You know, things that actually make money." He laughed, and a few others at the table chuckled along with him. The hot, treacherous tide of humiliation washed over her. It was a familiar feeling, but it never lost its sting. "It's a theoretical field," she said, her voice small. "Of course it is," he replied, his gaze already sliding past her, searching for someone more interesting, more valuable to engage with. The dismissal was absolute. Emmy felt the air in the club grow thin, suffocating. She needed to get out. With a mumbled excuse about needing the restroom, she stood up, her legs feeling a little unsteady beneath her. She pushed her way through the throng of bodies, feeling the fleeting, appraising glances of people, the quick assessment and subsequent dismissal. A ghost at the feast. She didn't belong here. She never would. The knowledge was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. Instead of turning towards the gilded signs for the restrooms, she found a small, unmarked door at the back of the club, one overlooked by most of the patrons. It opened onto a small balcony. The cold night air hit her like a physical relief, a blessed shock that washed the heat and the noise and the suffocating perfume from her skin. The rain had finally subsided, leaving behind a fine silver mist that created soft halos around the distant streetlights. Below, the service alley was dark and empty, save for a few monolithic dumpsters and the wet black gleam of the asphalt. She leaned against the wrought iron railing, the bitter cold of the metal seeping through the thin fabric of her blouse, grounding her. She closed her eyes, breathing in the clean, sharp scent of wet concrete and ozone. It was real. It was a smell she understood. She thought of Rhys. He would never ask about the monetary value of her work. He had listened to her, truly listened, when she'd once tried to explain the concept of Kant's categorical imperative. He had listened not with the polite, vacant patience of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but with an attentive, intelligent stillness that made her feel her words, her thoughts, had weight, had meaning. "You're an idiot," she chided herself in a fierce whisper. "He's Clarissa's driver. He's paid to be polite. It's his job." But deep down, in a place untouched by logic, she knew it was more than that. Politeness was a smooth, polished surface. What she felt from him was something with texture, with depth, a silent intellectual connection that defied the rigid logic of their separate worlds. She stood there for maybe 10 minutes, lost in thought, long enough for the chill to start seeping into her bones when the balcony door opened behind her. She didn't turn, expecting it to be Clarissa, come to scold her for her disappearance. "I thought I saw you step out." The voice wasn't Clarissa's. It was low, calm, unmistakable. Emmy's heart stopped, then kicked into overdrive, a frantic, hammering drum against her ribs. It felt like a trapped bird, desperate for escape. She turned, slowly, her movements feeling stiff and strange. Rhys was standing there a few feet away, a solid silhouette against the dim light from the club. He was no longer in his uniform. He wore dark jeans and a simple, long-sleeved black shirt that fit his broad shoulders and lean frame. Without the rigid formality of the uniform, he looked different, younger and yet somehow more imposing, more real, more dangerous. What are you doing here?" she managed to say, her voice a thin, breathless thread. Valet told me Miss Davenport would likely be ours. Figured I could stretch my legs, he explained, his tone neutral, calm. He moved closer, stopping beside her at the railing, but careful to maintain a respectful, unintrusive distance. The space between them felt charged, electric. I didn't mean to interrupt your thoughts. You didn't, she answered quickly, perhaps too quickly. I just needed some air, some quiet. He nodded, his gaze directed down at the dark alley below. It can be suffocating in there. The simple, empathetic statement, the fact that he understood without her needing to explain, opened a small but significant crack in her defensive armor. I don't like these places, she dared to state, framing it not as a question but as a conclusion she had already reached. A single muscle worked in his jaw. Let's just say I prefer places where people aren't trying so hard to be something they're not. The sentence hit her with the force of a revelation. It was the most honest thing she had heard all night. He had perfectly articulated the discomfort that had haunted her for years in Clarissa's world. He had given a name to her own sense of fraudulence. They stood in silence for a long moment, side by side at the iron railing, looking down into the darkness. It wasn't an awkward silence, not the kind that begs to be filled. It was a comfortable, breathing silence, filled by the soft, almost inaudible sound of the mist settling on the city and the distant, constant hum of a world that never slept. In that quiet space, Emmy felt a strange sense of equilibrium, as if she had finally found a frequency she could tune into, away from the jarring static inside the club. He was the one to break it, his voice low and thoughtful. "Your friend," he began, then paused as if weighing his words, searching for the right ones. It was a habit she'd noticed in him. He spoke with a deliberation that was rare, a stark contrast to the effortless, unthinking chatter of Clarissa's circle. "Clarissa," Emmy prompted, her curiosity piqued. She couldn't imagine what he, the silent observer, truly thought of her glittering, chaotic best friend. "She cares about you," he said finally. It wasn't what Emmy had expected. Deeply, in her own way. She doesn't know how to show it outside of her own context. Her language is different from yours. Emmy was taken aback by the observation. It was both simple and incredibly insightful. No one had ever defended Clarissa to her before, not with such quiet understanding. And coming from him, the man who was treated as little more than a piece of functional furniture by her friend, the perception was all the more surprising and all the more generous. He saw the intention beneath the often thoughtless execution. "I know," Emmy said, and the words felt truer coming from her lips after he had spoken them. "She has a good heart. It's just wrapped in a lot of layers of Chanel." A low sound escaped him. A chuckle. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a rich, warm, private sound that seemed to vibrate in the cold night air, wrapping around her. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh, even in this small, controlled way. The sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that it made her smile. A real, unforced smile that reached her eyes for the first time that evening. The tension in her shoulders eased. A knot she hadn't even realized she was holding slowly coming undone. "That's a good way to put it," he said. The echo of the smile still lingered on his lips, transforming the quiet severity of his face into something softer, more open, and incredibly handsome. In the dim, forgiving light of the balcony, she could see the intelligence in his eyes wasn't just weary. It was sharp, observant, alive. Emmy felt a sudden, unexpected heat rise in her face. She looked away, her gaze falling back to the wet asphalt of the alley, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thumping against her ribs. Being this close to him, without the physical and professional barrier of the car, was intoxicating. A different kind of chaos from the one inside the club, but just as overwhelming. She could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cold air, a solid, grounding presence. She could smell him, not the aggressive scent of expensive cologne worn by the men inside, but something clean and subtle, soap and rain and something else, something uniquely his. It was real. The confession tumbled out of her before she could stop it, a sudden need to be honest, to offer a piece of herself in return for the small moment of understanding he had given her. "It's my 21st birthday today," she blurted out, the words feeling loud and clumsy in the quiet. He turned to face her fully, the movement bringing him a subtle inch closer. The surprise in his eyes was genuine, unfeigned. "Tonight? And you're out here in the cold?" His voice was laced with a soft, incredulous concern that made her feel for the first time all night like the guest of honor. "The party doesn't feel like mine," she admitted, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Clarissa planned everything. It's the kind of party she thinks I should want. Loud music, champagne. I think I'd rather have a quiet room and a new book." His expression softened completely, the last vestiges of the driver's hard mask dissipating, replaced by something that looked a lot like empathy, a shared understanding of being an outsider in a world that wasn't built for you. "Well," he said, his voice a low murmur, "for what it's worth, from one quiet soul to another. Happy birthday, Emmy." "Thanks, Reese." Saying his name felt different now, intimate. It was a solid thing between them in the misty air. The moment stretched, the silence returning, but this time it was different. It was charged, humming with an electric, unspoken tension. He took a tiny, almost imperceptible step toward her, and Emmy's entire world seemed to shrink, collapsing to the small sacred space between them on that forgotten balcony. She watched, mesmerized, as his eyes, dark and serious, dropped to her mouth. She held her breath, her entire body on high alert, a strange mix of fear and anticipation coiling in her stomach. Every nerve ending was alight. This was it, a threshold. The balcony door flew open with a violent bang, shattering the delicate crystalline spell. "Emmy, there you are!" Clarissa exclaimed, her voice a shrill, unwelcome intrusion. "I've been looking all over for you. Honestly, we can't do the toast without the birthday girl. Come on, they're bringing out the vintage champagne." She stopped short, her celebratory tirade cut off as she noticed Reese for the first time. Her expression shifted with comical speed, from giddy excitement to mild confusion, and then to a faint, unmistakable annoyance. The social calculus in her mind was visibly whirring. The driver, on the private balcony, with her friend, it did not compute. "Reese?" Her tone was sharp, questioning. "What are you doing up here?" Instantly, the man who had shared a moment of quiet understanding with Emmy vanished. The mask of the professional driver, the blank, impassive facade, fell back into place with practiced ease. He took a half step back, and the distance between him and Emmy suddenly felt like a chasm, wide and uncrossable. The warmth between them evaporated, replaced by the cold night air. "Just getting some air, Miss Davenport," he said, his voice perfectly level, perfectly respectful. The man who had just wished her a happy birthday with a soft smile was gone. "I was just on my way back to the car." He gave Emmy one last, quick, unreadable glance. Was it an apology? A warning? She couldn't tell. Before moving past Clarissa with quiet efficiency, his broad shoulders brushing past her silk dress as he disappeared back into the noise and heat of the club. Emmy stood there, her heart still hammering a wild, erratic rhythm against her ribs. A new chill was setting in, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had just been granted a brief, intoxicating glimpse of the man behind the facade, the man she had sensed was there all along, and the sight had left her with a desperate, aching hunger for more. A hunger that now felt like a liability, a secret she had to keep, even from herself. The return to the club's interior was like plunging back into deep, cold water after a desperate, life-giving gasp of air. The noise, the heat, the sheer density of bodies hit her again, but this time it all seemed distant, muffled, as if she were hearing it from behind a wall of glass. Emmy's mind was miles away, still trapped in that suspended, silent moment on the balcony. The sound of Reese's low, warm chuckle echoed in her ears, a secret melody playing on a loop beneath the relentless, pounding beat of the music. The intensity of his gaze as he'd looked at her mouth was seared into her memory, a brand of heat on her skin. The image of him out of uniform, relaxed and real and dangerously handsome, was so vivid she could almost feel the warmth of his presence beside her, a phantom limb in the crowded room. "What was that all about?" Clarissa asked, her voice a sharp probe as she guided Emmy back toward the velvet booth. There was a distinct hint of disapproval in her tone, the proprietary air of an owner questioning why a tool was out of place. "Getting a little friendly with the driver, aren't we?" "We were just getting some air, Risa," Emmy replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She was surprised by her own ability to lie, to erect a placid facade over the earthquake that had just shaken her foundations. He was being polite. It was nothing. "He's paid to be polite," Clarissa retorted, the distinction crucial in her world. But her butterfly attention span was already being diverted. by someone waving from across the room, a new, shiny object to focus on. "Oh, there's Carter. I have to tell him about Sabrina's disastrous new hair." The incident for Clarissa was already forgotten, a minor, insignificant detail in the grand, glittering tapestry of her night. For Emmy, however, it was a tectonic shift. The interaction had redefined everything. The quiet, intellectual fantasy she had built in her mind, the idea of a silent connection with a kindred spirit, suddenly had a voice. It had a face, unshadowed by a driver's cap. It had a laugh. And it was 1,000 times more potent, more real and more dangerous than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. The rest of the night passed in a surreal blur. She drank the vintage champagne she was offered, the bubbly, cold liquid sliding down her throat, but she didn't feel its celebratory effect. It tasted like ash. She smiled. She nodded. She even managed to laugh at the right moments, a perfectly trained automaton performing the social rites she had learned through years of navigating Clarissa's world. Her friends, Clarissa's friends, wished her a happy birthday, presented her with an obscenely overpriced cake adorned with candles that looked like tiny, elegant torches, and sang a tuneless, enthusiastic version of the traditional song. Through every moment, she felt like a ghost, a spectator at her own life. Her thoughts were a relentless, chaotic whirlwind, the way Reese's eyes had softened when she told him it was her birthday. The tiny, deliberate step he'd taken toward her, a move that promised to close the impossible distance between them. What would have happened if Clarissa hadn't appeared? The question haunted her, a ghost of a possibility that made her skin tingle and her stomach clench. Would he have kissed me? "He works for her family," a cold, rational voice screamed in the back of her mind. "This is insane, it's forbidden, it's impossible, you're imagining things." But her heart, a stubborn, reckless organ, refused to listen. What she had felt on that balcony wasn't her imagination. It was electric, it was mutual, it was undeniable. Finally, close to 2 in the morning, the party's manic energy began to wane. Clarissa, after several more glasses of champagne, was sleepy and content, her social obligations fulfilled. "Okay, I think I've celebrated enough for you," she yawned, stretching gracefully. "Let's go home." The walk back to the front of the club was a time warp, each step feeling both too fast and agonizingly slow. Emmy felt every single one, a new anxiety coiling in her stomach like a tight, cold knot. What would she say to him? How would she act? Would the car be silent and awkward, the professional walls back up thicker than ever? Or would the tension that had crackled between them on the balcony still be there, now confined and amplified in that small, intimate space? The Maybach was waiting at the curb, a dark, sleek cocoon in the sleeping, rain-washed street. Reese was outside, holding the rear door open, his posture perfect, his expression unreadable. The professional mask was firmly, impenetrably in place. He was a statue carved from shadow. But as Emmy passed him to get into the car, her fingers, as if by their own volition, brushed against the back of his hand. It was a touch so light, so accidental, it could have been a stray raindrop. It lasted no longer than the flutter of a hummingbird's wing, but a jolt of pure, unadulterated heat shot up her arm, straight to her heart. She caught her breath, her wide eyes meeting his for a single shattering second, and in the deep, unreadable darkness of his gaze, she saw a flicker, a recognition, a confirmation. He had felt it, too. It wasn't her imagination. Clarissa tumbled into the seat beside her and fell asleep almost instantly, her head lolling at an uncomfortable, childlike angle. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding through the deserted, glistening streets. This time, the silence wasn't artificial. It was heavy, pregnant, charged with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Emmy could hear the sound of her own breathing, shallow and quick. She could hear the frantic, insistent beat of her heart in her ears. She watched him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were fixed on the road, his focus absolute, but the usual relaxed calm in his hands on the wheel looked forced. His knuckles were white, a small but telling detail. First, they dropped Clarissa off at her luxury high-rise. Reese performed his duties with the same flawless, detached efficiency as always. He got out, opened the door for the sleepy girl, and helped her into the gleaming lobby, handing her off to the night doorman with a polite, deferential word. Emmy watched the scene play out, her heart tight with a confusing mix of emotions. Pity, resentment, longing. This was his life. Serving, waiting, always on the periphery of an opulence he could never touch. When he returned to the car, closing the door behind him, the air grew even thicker. The space seemed to shrink. It was just the two of them now, a man and a woman, stripped of their audience. "To your apartment now?" he asked, his voice a low, rough thing, hoarse with unspoken tension. "Yes, please." The drive to Emmy's more modest neighborhood was only 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity, a lifetime. Neither of them spoke. The city drifted by outside the windows, a kaleidoscope of blurred, lonely lights. Emmy was painfully, exquisitely aware of every minute detail of their shared space: the rich, clean smell of leather and rain, the soft, rhythmic tick of the dashboard clock counting down the seconds they had left, his solid, physical presence just a few feet away, a magnetic force she could feel in her very bones. "Say something," she pleaded with herself, her mind racing. "Say anything." But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped behind the same barrier that separated their worlds. What could she possibly say? Was that moment on the balcony real, or have I finally gone insane? When the car glided to a stop in front of her familiar 3-story brick building, reality hit her like a physical blow. The moment was over. The spell was broken. He would drive away, and tomorrow everything would go back to the way it was. The driver and the boss's friend. An uncrossable divide. The thought was unbearable. A silent scream of protest rose in her chest. "Not yet. Please, not yet." He cut the engine. The low, resonant hum of the powerful motor died, plunging them into a silence that was near total. The absence of sound was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that settled over them, amplifying the frantic beat of Emmy's heart. He made no move to get out and open her door, a break in the otherwise flawless protocol. He just sat there, his large, capable hands still resting on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. He was looking at her building, but she knew he wasn't really seeing it. His focus was turned inward, caught in the same silent internal battle as she was. The moments stretched, each one a long, drawn-out eternity. The space between them crackled. Amy knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that if she got out of the car now, this fragile, shimmering thing between them would dissolve like smoke. Tomorrow, he would be Reese the driver again, and she would be Miss Davenport's friend, and the memory of the man on the balcony would become a ghost, a dream she would begin to doubt she ever had. The thought was unbearable. It was a loss she wasn't willing to accept. "Well," Emmy said, her own voice sounding fragile and foreign to her ears, a small trembling thing breaking the profound quiet. "Thanks for the ride. And for before." The words were inadequate, a paltry offering in the face of the monumental, unspoken thing that filled the car. "For what?" he asked, his voice low and rough. He still didn't look at her, but she saw the muscles in his jaw clench. "For the happy birthday," she whispered, the words barely audible. It was the only one that felt real tonight. That finally made him turn. He shifted in his seat, his body angling toward her. In the dim, moody glow of the streetlights filtering through the windshield, his face was a landscape of shadows and light. His eyes, dark and unreadable, found hers. He studied her for a long, breathless moment, his gaze so intense, so probing, it felt like a physical touch, tracing the lines of her face, seeking the truth in her eyes. She felt utterly exposed, as if he could see straight into her lonely, hopeful heart. "You deserve more than that, Emmy," he said, and his voice was no longer the neutral tone of a driver. It was low, personal, and laden with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. It sounded like anger, but an anger directed not at her but at the world that had failed her. More than parties that aren't yours, more than people who don't listen when you speak. His words completely and utterly disarmed her. They were a key, turning a lock inside her she didn't even know was there. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart, the ones that protected her from the casual cruelties of Clarissa's world, simply crumbled into dust. The tears she had been holding back all night, a hot, stinging pressure behind her eyes, finally welled and spilled over, tracing silent, warm paths down her cold cheeks. He saw her. He didn't just see her. He understood the precise nature of her loneliness. In the midst of that entire glittering, indifferent crowd, he was the only one who had truly seen her at all. Impulse took over. It was not a thought, but a deep, primal instinct, an irresistible force born of a year's worth of quiet observation, of a single night's profound loneliness, of a desperate gratitude, and of an overwhelming, undeniable desire. She didn't want the night to end. She didn't want him to end. She wanted more of this feeling of being real. "Do you—" she began, her voice catching, her heart pounding so hard against her ribs she was sure he could hear it, a frantic drum in the quiet car. "Do you want to come in?" The question hung in the air, bold and terrifying. She rushed to soften it, to give him an escape. "For coffee or anything, it's the least I can do." The air in the car went utterly still. The question stopped being a simple invitation and became a tangible thing. It hung between them, shimmering with all its implications, with all its danger and all its promise. She watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw the struggle in his eyes, a flicker of raw conflict. It was hesitation. It was the war between a lifetime of disciplined control and a single reckless human moment, between duty and something far more primal. She had offered him a choice, to remain the driver or to become the man, to stay, to cross the line. He looked away from her, his gaze dropping to his own hands on the steering wheel, as if they belonged to a stranger. Then he looked at her unassuming brick building, a world away from the one he had just come from. And then, finally, his eyes came back to hers. The intensity in his gaze was so absolute it stole the breath from her lungs. The war was over. A decision had been made. "Coffee," he said, his voice little more than a murmur, a rough, gravelly sound that vibrated through her. "I'd like that." The simple answer was like a lock clicking open, releasing a wave of both dizzying relief and heart-stopping panic through her. She had done it. She had invited the forbidden into her life. She had no idea what she was doing, where this was going, what the consequences would be. The only thing she knew with a certainty that eclipsed all fear was that for the first time in a very, very long time, she no longer felt alone. And as she watched him turn off the car's interior lights, plunging them into a more intimate darkness, and unbuckle his seatbelt with a soft, decisive click, she knew, with a terrifying and thrilling certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. The world had tilted on its axis, and she had been the one to push it. The hallway of Emmy's building smelled of old books and dried lavender, a scent that clung to the aged wood and plaster, a comforting academic aroma that was the polar opposite of the sterile, new car scent of leather and polish she had just left behind. It was the smell of her life. The sound of their footsteps echoed on the worn linoleum floor, a stark, lonely sound in the late-night stillness of the old building. The soft, expensive click of his leather-soled shoes was a foreign intrusion, a counterpoint to the nervous, soft scuff of her own worn boots. Each step she took toward her apartment door, number 3B, felt simultaneously like a march toward an inevitable, longed-for safety, and a terrifying, willing walk off the edge of a cliff. Her hand, when she raised it to the lock, trembled slightly. She was intensely aware of this small betrayal of her body, this visible evidence of the maelstrom churning inside her. She fumbled with the key, the metal scraping against the lock plate, with a sound that seemed deafeningly loud. Her heart was a wild thing in her chest, a frantic, hammering beat that felt far too powerful for the quiet, sleeping hallway. She could feel him behind her, not touching, but his presence was a solid, warm weight in the air that took up all the space, all the oxygen. He was so close she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his body, could smell the lingering clean scent of rain on his coat. It was crazy. It was reckless, a flagrant breach of every unspoken social contract that governed her life with Clarissa. It was the only thing in the world she wanted. The door finally opened with a familiar, gentle creak, a sound as familiar to her as her own breathing. "It's not much," she murmured, the words aimed at the floor, her voice barely audible, a token apology for the world she was about to reveal. "But it's mine." She flicked on a switch, and the room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of a single floor lamp. The apartment was a single large room, a studio that served as her bedroom, living room, and study all at once. It had good bones, exposed brick walls that spoke of the building's history, and tall, elegant windows that overlooked the quiet, dark back alley. But it wasn't the architecture that defined the space. It was what was inside. Books. They were the dominant feature, the defining principle of her existence. Stacks of hardcovers and paperbacks covered almost every available surface, rising from the floor in precarious towers. Academic journals and articles with furiously scribbled notes in the margins were spread across a large, scarred oak desk. A massive whiteboard, her external brain, was covered in a chaotic web of diagrams, quotes, and dissertation notes. The air itself was thick with the scent she loved most in the world, the holy trinity of old paper, brewing coffee, and the faint, sharp smell of dust. It was her sanctuary, her fortress, her mind made visible. And in showing it to him, she felt suddenly terrifyingly vulnerable, as if she hadn't just opened her front door, but had peeled back her own ribs to show him her beating heart. He stepped inside behind her, his large frame seeming to fill the small entryway. He closed the door, and the soft, solid click of the lock engaging seemed to seal the world out, creating a new, private universe that contained only the two of them. The sound reverberated through her, a point of no return. In her mind the name shifted, solidifying. Reese. She had to stop thinking of him as the driver. He was Reese, the man who stood in her apartment, looking at her life. He said nothing for a long, contemplative moment. His eyes, dark and serious in the warm light, swept the room. She watched him watch her world, bracing for a judgment that never came. He took it all in, the overflowing bookshelves, the chaotic whiteboard, the small, tidy kitchen in the corner. His gaze wasn't that of a stranger. It was like that of a connoisseur, a scholar appreciating a rare and complex library for the first time, seeing not the mess, but the meaning. "It's incredible," he said finally, his voice a low, genuine thing, filled with a quiet reverence she had never heard from anyone. "It's not just a room, it's full of thought, it's alive." The simple, profound compliment struck her more deeply than any flowery flattery she had ever heard. People saw her books and called her a nerd. They saw her notes and called her intense. He saw a living mind. He saw her. "Thank you," she whispered, a genuine warmth spreading through her veins, chasing away the last of the night's chill. She shrugged off her damp coat, tossing it with false nonchalance over the back of a reading chair. I'll make the coffee." The mundane task was an anchor in a turbulent, uncharted sea of emotions. She moved toward the small kitchen alcove, painfully aware of his gaze following her every move. Her hands, to her immense frustration, still shook as she reached into the cupboard for the coffee grounds and the filter. She could feel the tension coiling in the air between them, a tangible, humming thing, a taut rope about to snap. He moved from the doorway, his steps nearly silent, and came to a stop on the other side of the small butcher block counter that separated the kitchen from the rest of the room. The proximity, even with the counter between them, was dizzying. In the warmer, kinder light of her apartment, she could see the details the darkness of the car had hidden, the tiny, faint lines around his eyes, suggesting a man who thought more than he smiled, the dark shadow of stubble on his strong, sharp jaw, the sheer, solid presence of him. "Let me," he said softly. He reached out, his hand covering hers for a brief, searing moment as he took the bag of coffee from her grasp. The touch was like a live ember pressed against her skin, sending a shockwave straight up her arm. She recoiled slightly, a purely involuntary reaction, her breath catching in her throat as she ceded the space. She leaned back against the opposite counter, watching him. He moved with a quiet, contained efficiency, a certainty in his motions that was mesmerizing. He measured the coffee, his movements precise and unhurried. He filled the machine with water. There was nothing subservient in his actions now. He was simply a man, making coffee in a woman's kitchen in the dead of night. He didn't belong here, with his expensive, tailored clothes and his air of restrained power, and yet, somehow, he fit into the quiet, intellectual space of her apartment more perfectly than anyone ever had. "You know," she began, her voice a little unsteady, needing to fill the humming silence, needing to understand. "On the balcony, I felt—" She trailed off, the words inadequate. He stopped what he was doing, his hand stilling over the coffee maker. He lifted his head, and his eyes, a deep, stormy blue, met hers across the small space. The intensity in his gaze was a physical force, silencing her before she could even finish. "I felt it too," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. And those 4 simple words confirmed everything. It wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't one-sided. It was real. The low gurgling hum of the coffee maker starting to brew was the only sound in the apartment. Time itself seemed to slow down, to stretch and thicken like honey. He came around the counter, his movements deliberate, erasing the last bit of safe distance that remained between them. He stopped just inches away from her, so close she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. So close she could see the faint golden flecks in the blue of his irises, could see the reflection of her own small lamp in his dilated pupils. "I shouldn't be here, Emmy," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, a confession. "I know," she replied, her own voice a breath, her throat suddenly tight. "This complicates everything." "I know." He raised his hand, the movement slow, graceful, as if not to startle her. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his fingers hovering in the air just before her face, a final moment of choice. Then he touched her. His fingers, warm and slightly rough from the wheel of the car, made contact with the soft skin of her cheek. The touch was electric, a quiet, devastating explosion that sent a tremor through her entire body. She closed her eyes, a gesture of pure surrender, leaning into the warmth, into the reality of his touch. "But I don't think," he whispered, his warm breath a ghost against her lips, "that I can leave." It wasn't a gentle exploration. It wasn't a hesitant question. It was a surrender, a kiss that carried the entire crushing weight of weeks of shared silences, of unspoken words, of a simmering, forbidden attraction that had been kept under the ironclad control of duty and circumstance. His lips were firm and warm, moving over hers not with aggression, but with a profound, undeniable hunger that left her breathless, her mind blissfully blank. It was the hunger of a man starved for something real, and in her he had found it. She answered with the same raw, unrestrained urgency, all her carefully constructed walls of logic, all her cynical theories about the world, crumbled into dust. Her arms, as if with a will of their own, wound around his neck, her fingers tangling in the surprisingly soft hair at his nape. He responded by pulling her closer, his large hand sliding down to the small of her back, pressing her body against the hard, solid length of his, until there was no space, no air, no separation between them. She gasped against his mouth, a small broken sound, feeling the unyielding wall of his chest, the sheer, controlled strength of his embrace. This was what she had been missing, this feeling of being held, of being anchored in a world where she constantly felt adrift. It was more than a physical act. It was a collision of two solitudes. It was a desperate, beautiful fusion of two souls that had recognized each other in the darkness, across the impossibly wide chasm of their different worlds. In the whispers in the half-light of her small apartment, in the murmured, breathless sounds of their names, Emmy felt the final barriers within herself dissolve. She opened herself to him completely, an act of terrifying and absolute trust, offering not just her body but her vulnerability, her fiercely guarded heart, her quiet, lonely soul. The world narrowed to a single point of incandescent feeling, a rising, cresting wave of pleasure and pure emotion so overwhelming, so profound, it made her cry out his name, the sound both a plea and a prayer in the stillness of the room. In that moment of absolute release, of total surrender, she felt a connection so deep, so elemental. It felt as if their very souls had finally touched, finally spoken the same language after a lifetime of silence. When the storm finally passed, they lay tangled in her sheets, their bodies damp, their limbs intertwined, the rhythm of their breathing slowly falling into a shared, peaceful cadence. Her heart, which had been a frantic drum, was now beating strong and slow against his chest. The comforting, solid weight of his arm, draped over her, was an anchor in the quiet aftermath. The silence that settled in the room was not empty, but full. It was full of the resonance of what had just happened, a living, breathing entity that hummed with intimacy. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she had never been before, yet strangely, profoundly safe. For the first time, perhaps in her entire life, she felt completely and utterly understood, not just her mind, but her body, her soul. And as she lay there, cocooned in the comforting darkness of her little sanctuary, listening to the sound of his breathing deepening beside her as sleep began to claim him, a terrifying and wonderful thought took shape in her mind, as clear and bright as a star in the night sky. She was falling in love with him, and she knew absolutely nothing about the real man beside her. Emmy woke slowly, emerging from a deep, dreamless sleep into a state of lazy, sensory awareness. The first thing to register was touch, the soft, warm tangle of the cotton sheets on her bare skin, and the comforting, solid weight of the duvet over them. The second was smell. His scent was everywhere, an intimate, unique blend of his skin, her simple lavender soap, and the clean, masculine musk that was uniquely his. It had permeated her pillow, her sheets, the very air she breathed. It was the scent of him, of them. She smiled before she even opened her eyes. A sleepy, languid, utterly contented smile that came from a deep, previously untouched place in her soul. She rolled over, her body warm and aching in the most pleasant way, reaching a hand out to the other side of the bed. She expected to find the solid, living warmth of his body, the firm landscape of his back or shoulder. She found only a cool, empty space. Her eyes snapped open. Panic, icy and instant, shot through her veins, a brutal shock to her blissed-out system. He was gone. The single thought was a physical blow. He regretted it. Of course he did. It had just been one night, a mistake, a reckless indiscretion for the bored driver. The familiar, bitter taste of humiliation began to bubble up in her chest, hot and acidic. She sat bolt upright, the sheet falling to her waist, her heart pounding a frantic, erratic tattoo against her ribs. She had been a fool, a naive, romantic fool. And then she heard it, a soft domestic sound from the main room, the quiet ceramic click of a mug being set down on her wooden counter. And then, the smell. Not the faint, stale scent of coffee from the machine the night before, but the rich, deep, life-affirming aroma of a fresh brew. He hadn't left. A wave of relief so powerful, so overwhelming, flooded her that she felt dizzy, her head light. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm her racing, ridiculous heart. He was still here. He had stayed. In the morning light, he was still here. That meant something. It had to mean everything. With her heart still a little unsteady, she looked down and saw his long-sleeved black shirt lying on the floor where it had been discarded in the passionate haste of the previous night. On impulse, she picked it up and slipped it on. The sleeves were far too long, completely covering her hands, and the hem fell to mid-thigh like a short dress. The soft, worn cotton was infused with his scent, and wrapping it around herself felt like the most intimate, possessive gesture she could imagine. It felt like wearing a piece of him. She padded barefoot out of the small bedroom alcove and stopped in the entryway, her breath catching in her throat. He was standing with his back to her, wearing only his jeans from the night before. The pale grey morning light streamed through the tall windows, tracing the elegant, powerful musculature of his back and shoulders. He wasn't doing anything. He was simply standing, completely still, in front of her main bookshelf, his head tilted slightly as if he were reading the spines of her books, absorbing the story of her mind. He wasn't just looking, he was seeing. "I can never get them organized right," she said softly, her voice a little hoarse. He turned, and the smile that spread across his face when he saw her standing there, small and slightly lost in his shirt, made her stomach do a delightful, dizzying flip. It wasn't the contained, professional half-smile she saw in the car. This was a genuine, open, and devastatingly handsome smile that reached his eyes, making them crinkle at the corners and lighting them from within. "I disagree," he said, his voice low and a little rough from sleep. "I think they tell a perfect story." She felt her face flush with a pleasure that was sharp and sweet. No one had ever looked at her chaotic collection of books and seen a story. They saw theory, dust, a hobby. He saw the soul. He held out a hand, a simple, open invitation. She went to him without hesitation, placing her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, a perfect, natural fit. He gently pulled her closer until she was standing before him, the worn fabric of his shirt a soft barrier between them. His other hand came up to brush a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingertips grazing her cheek with a tenderness that made her melt inside, her bones feeling like warm honey. "Good morning," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "Good morning," she replied, her voice barely audible. The moment was charged with a quiet, breathtaking intimacy. The grey morning light, the silent walls of books, the rich smell of coffee, the two of them standing in the middle of her sanctuary. It was domestic, it was real, and it was terrifyingly beautiful. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a completely different kiss from the night before. There was none of the desperate urgency, none of the hunger to erase the distance. This was soft, slow, full of a tender, lingering affection that spoke louder than any words. It was a kiss that said, "I'm still here. I don't regret this." "I made coffee," he said, when they pulled apart, resting his forehead against hers. He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if he did it every morning. The days that followed were an exercise in exquisite torture and secret bliss. The Maybach, which had once been her silent sanctuary, transformed into a chamber of almost unbearable tension. Every ride with Clarissa was a masterful performance. Amy learned to control her breathing when he opened the door for her, to keep her eyes fixed resolutely on the cityscape, when all she wanted to do was meet his gaze in the rearview mirror. But the stolen moments were everything. They built a secret world, a fragile, beautiful republic of two, governed by coded text messages on cheap burner phones and clandestine meetings in forgotten corners of the city. A quiet park bench, a dusty corner of a second-hand bookstore. To Emmy, he was no longer Reese the driver, but just Finn, a name he had given her, one that seemed to fit him perfectly. He said it was his middle name, a simple, strong name for a man whose soul seemed to mirror her own. He never spoke of his life, and she, respecting his need for privacy, never asked. It was enough that in their secret world they were just Emmy and Finn. She was falling deeper, more irrevocably in love every day. Then came the invitation, the annual Bar Association Ball, a major fundraising event for legal aid services. Clarissa, whose father was on the board, insisted Emmy go. "It's for a good cause, Emmy. You can't say no. Besides," she added, her eyes sparkling with gossip, "Dad said Judge Cooper might actually make an appearance this year. Can you imagine? He never goes anywhere. They say he's a recluse, a billionaire genius." Emmy shrugged, a flicker of interest passing through her. She'd read some of Judge Cooper's opinions. They were brilliant, incisive, and surprisingly compassionate. Still, the drama of the city's powerful elite sounded exhausting. The night of the ball arrived. The hotel ballroom was a spectacle of blinding opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the gilded ceiling, casting a brilliant, unforgiving light over a sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. Emmy felt every single one of the 1,000 eyes on her as she walked beside Clarissa, acutely aware of her borrowed dress and her profound sense of being an imposter. Her mind was outside, in the cold, with the man who truly understood her, the man who was waiting to drive her home. The painful irony was a sharp ache in her chest. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, and a hush fell over the crowd. An elegant, older man took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice amplified by the microphone, "it is with immense honor that I introduce our host and primary benefactor, a man whose brilliant mind has shaped modern jurisprudence, but who prefers the quiet, vital work of justice to the spotlight. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Judge Finn Cooper." A polite, respectful round of applause rippled through the hall. Emmy leaned forward, her curiosity finally, truly piqued despite herself. She wanted to see the face of the brilliant mind she so admired. A tall, powerfully built man stepped out from the shadows of the wings into the bright, unforgiving center of the stage. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders like a second skin. The spotlight hit him, and Emmy's heart stopped beating. No, it couldn't be. The thought was not a thought at all, but a silent, primal scream in the core of her being. The entire glittering world tilted violently on its axis. The sounds of the ballroom, the polite applause, the soft clinking of glasses, Clarissa's sharp, excited intake of breath beside her, all faded into a distant, high-pitched hum, the sound of a universe collapsing. The air, thick with perfume and champagne, was suddenly sucked from her lungs. She couldn't breathe. It was him, the man on the stage, the reclusive legal genius, the powerful, respected, honorable Judge Finn Cooper. It was Reese. It was her Finn. He stood there, bathed in the stark white light of the spotlight, looking completely, terrifyingly at ease. This was not a man in a costume. This was a man in his native habitat. The quiet, contained stillness she had mistaken for humility was, in fact, the effortless calm of absolute power. The authority she had sensed in him was not a quirk of personality. It was the ingrained reality of a man who moved worlds with his words. He wasn't the driver, a silent observer on the periphery. He was a predator at the absolute top of his domain, and he was a complete, devastating stranger. As he stepped up to the podium and began to speak, his voice, that same low, calm, resonant voice that had whispered her name in the darkness of her apartment, filled the cavernous hall, commanding the attention of every person in the room. He spoke about justice, about the duty to serve those without a voice. And as he spoke, his eyes, the eyes of a judge accustomed to assessing every detail, scanned the crowd. And then they found her. Across the vast, crowded room, his gaze locked with hers. And for a single, shattering, eternal second, the mask of the Honorable Judge Finn Cooper cracked. She saw a flash of raw, undisguised panic in his eyes. She saw the man who had held her in his arms, the man who had made coffee for her in her kitchen, the man she had fallen in love with. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back, colder, more remote, and more impenetrable than ever. But it was too late. Emmy's world had already shattered into a million glittering, razor-sharp pieces. The connection, their night, the secret messages, the shared books, the quiet laughter on the balcony. It was all a lie. An elaborate, cruel, incomprehensible lie. She wasn't the only one who saw him for who he truly was. She was the only one who had no idea who he was at all. She was the fool, the joke, the naive little intern who served as a diversion, a brief, interesting sojourn into authenticity for the bored, isolated judge. The delicate, long-stemmed champagne flute slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, falling to the polished marble floor. It shattered with a sharp, crystalline sound that no one but her seemed to hear. It was the sound of her heart breaking. "Explain what part of the lie, Finn, or should I call you Your Honor?" Her voice, when she finally confronted him on the cold, wind-swept street outside, was a raw, trembling thing, laced with a venom she didn't know she possessed. "The part where you pretended to be someone you're not, or the part where you let me believe we had something real, when I was just, what, a research project? A case study of the common folk for the judge in the ivory tower?" The days that followed were a grey, featureless landscape of pain. Anger gave way to a hollow, aching emptiness. She built a fortress of cynicism around her heart, brick by painful brick. Then the envelope arrived. It was thick, cream-colored, and bore the seal of the city's most prestigious university. An invitation to a special guest lecture. The topic, Justice and Humanity, Beyond the Letter of the Law. The keynote speaker was listed as an anonymous donor. The arrogance of the gesture, the sheer audacity, infuriated her. He thought he could summon her with a formal invitation, but she went, not for hope. Hope was a dead thing. She went for pride. To stand in the same room with him and show him that he hadn't broken her. The university auditorium was a grand, historic space with dark wood paneling and soaring ceilings, but it was nearly empty. The vast sea of velvet seats was dark. The lights were low, focused on the stage, and on the stage, under a single soft spotlight, there was no podium, no panel of speakers, just a single, elegant reading chair and a small table with 2 glasses of water. It was not a public lecture. It was a private audience. And then she saw it. On the vast, empty walls of the auditorium, where portraits of long-dead deans would normally hang, were massive, beautifully printed and framed enlargements. They were pages from her work, an article she'd published in a small law review, an essay on ethics she'd written as an undergrad, a page from her graduate thesis, her own handwriting, with its frantic, passionate notes, magnified and displayed like a work of art. Each one was lit with the reverent, focused precision of a museum curator. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice thick, the anger inside her faltering, replaced by a wave of dizzying confusion. "It's my verdict." His voice came from the shadows at the edge of the stage. Finn stepped into the light. He wore no tuxedo, no uniform, just simple dark trousers and a cashmere sweater, much like her own. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes, and a profound weariness in his posture, but his eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a raw, desperate, vulnerable emotion. "Words are cheap," he said, his voice low and earnest, stripped of its judicial authority. "I know that now. I lied to you with words, so I wanted to show you the truth." He walked toward her, not stopping on the stage, but coming down the short steps onto the auditorium floor, meeting her on her own level. "This is the truth, Emmy. The truth is that from the very first day I didn't see my boss's friend. I saw a mind. I saw the way you wrestled with ideas, the passion in your frustration. I saw the integrity you were searching for because it lived inside you. I saw it in your eyes long before I ever read it in your work." He stopped a few feet away, his hands at his sides, open and empty, a gesture of surrender. I didn't use my money to impress you, Emmy. I used it to create a space where I could show you what I saw, to show the world what I saw, to show you that I saw you, the real you, the scholar, the thinker, the woman with a soul so vibrant and a mind so brilliant that it spills onto everything you touch. He took a deep breath, the confession costing him dearly. I lied about who I was. It was cowardly and it was wrong. I was isolated and afraid, and my fear hurt you. I will spend the rest of my life regretting that pain, but I never, not for 1 second, lied about what I felt when I was with you, and I never ever lied about what I saw when I looked at you. Silent tears began to trace hot paths down Emmy's cold face. They weren't the tears of anger or humiliation from the night of the ball. They were tears of something far more complicated, something painful and beautiful that ached in her chest. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the gesture was overwhelming. He hadn't bought her a piece of jewelry or a car. He had taken the most vulnerable, most sacred part of her, her mind on paper, and he had placed it on a pedestal, declaring it a masterpiece. He glanced up at the framed page of her thesis on the wall. "I know this is how you see me now," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound pain. "A liar, a judge, a symbol of a system you believe is broken, and you have every right to. But I want the chance, however small, to show you that there's more humanity than law in me, if you'll let me." He stood there, stripped of his lies, his wealth, his power, his title. It was just Finn, offering her the only thing of value he had left, the truth of how he saw her. The choice, as it always should have been, was hers. She let her gaze drift from his tired, earnest face to the walls around her. To her life, her dreams, her insecurities, all laid bare and treated with a reverence she herself rarely afforded them. She looked at a quote she had scribbled in a margin, magnified for the world to see, and instead of feeling exposed, she felt seen, deeply and completely seen. Slowly, as if afraid the movement might shatter the fragile, sacred moment, she reached out her hand. She didn't touch his face or his chest. Instead, she laid her palm flat over his heart. She could feel the strong, steady, frantic beat beneath her hand. Real. "One day at a time," she whispered, her own voice breaking on the words. A wave of relief so profound washed over Finn's face that it seemed to erase the lines of tension and exhaustion, making him look years younger. He covered her hand with his long fingers wrapping around hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest, as if to anchor himself to her. "One day at a time," he echoed, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He didn't kiss her. The moment was too fragile, too sacred for that. Instead, he simply pulled her into a hug. He wrapped his arms around her and held her, not with the desperate, consuming passion of that first night, but with a reverent, heartbreaking tenderness, as if he were holding the most precious, irreplaceable thing in the universe. Emmy buried her face in his chest, inhaling his scent, the real scent of him, the scent of Finn. And for the first time in 2 agonizing weeks, she allowed herself to feel something other than pain. She felt a small, trembling, terrifying seed of hope begin to unfurl in the wasteland of her heart. The road ahead would be long. Trust, once shattered, would have to be rebuilt, piece by painstaking piece, argument by truthful argument. But here, in this silent, empty auditorium, surrounded by the story of their souls on paper, they had a foundation. It wasn't perfect. It was cracked and patched, but it was real, and for the first time, they were both looking at it without disguises, ready, finally, to start building something new together, in the honest, unforgiving light of the truth. For sometimes the most important justice is not the one found in law books, but the pardon one heart grants another. Trust once broken is never the same, but sometimes it can be rebuilt into something stronger.